the ultra-Orthodox population, for example, in terms of the army. That was an important law that was passed. And I wonder if these issues, and especially this law, was this just a temporary phenomenon? We'll see things go back to where they were, or do you see this is lasting in some ways? I don't know who wants to start.
Basically the main, the key reforms that Lapid managed to somehow force on the previous government was to move forward in terms of enlisting ultra-Orthodox in the military. When the key element of that legislation was making sure, adding criminal sanctions, they call it, making it a criminal offense for Haredi young men not to enlist in the army after they study and under very specific conditions and under certain circumstances. But that was a big deal. The other main issue was enforcing what they call core issues on the ultra-Orthodox school system, because up to now you can study in this government-funded ultra-Orthodox system for 12 years or more, but have English and science and math on a third grade level because these are not important issues for them. And what Lapid was trying to do is say, well, you know, you're a public school system funded by the government, you need to teach these core issues. Frankly, none of these issues really was enforced before this government went to elections. So there is no real change on the ground, but I believe that now with Shas and UTJ in the government, they'll just roll back even the formal legislation on that.
Yeah, I mean, I cannot imagine that they would join a government that would not do that, and that, of course, it may also show. I'm looking at the long-term perspective. Of course, if you look at the very long-term perspective from Israel, starting in 1948 until today, you see a tremendous change from left to right. But even if you look, say, from the 1980s and 90s onwards, you might see that as well. And demographically, I think, especially if it comes to the religious sector and the ultra-Orthodox sector, but the religious sector in general, it reflects demographics. I mean, it reflects a much higher number of children. And my question basically is there any hope for parties, and I wouldn't say even left, but center and left parties to come back? By the way, I remember the polls. There is a pattern. I think the first time in 1996, back then there was a short period when Israelis voted directly for the prime minister, and they basically went to bed with Peres and woke up with Netanyahu, who then became prime minister first time. It was the same error in the polls. It was a very close margin then. But it happened after that as well. And I think there is a certain pattern that the exit polls and the polls before kind of favor the left, and then it's always the same disappointment. One exception, maybe the 1999 election where Ehud Barak won. But considering considering this development since really 1977, when Likud under Menachem Begin became for the first time the largest, he became for the first time prime minister of a Likud party. Is there any hope for the other camp to come back? What has to happen for that?
I think the short answer is yes. I think there is. I think you're absolutely right that the right wing has been dominant for decades. In fact, since 1977, it's really been mostly the right wing governing. There have been two elections where the left won outright. One was Rabin in 92, and then Ehud Barak in 99. And there were other governments by Kadima, which was really mostly an offshoot of the Likud, of the right wing. So it's really been the Likud's to lose. But if you look at these results too, you saw the opposition with 53 likely recommenders, Netanyahu with 57, plus Kahlon, which, as Nathan said, could have gone either way. And so these elections were in fact not a landslide. Netanyahu won decisively in the sense that forming a coalition for Herzog would be very hard. The 53 would not all join his coalition. He'd then have to go and bring the ultra-Orthodox in, convince them to sit together with Lapid. It would be very hard. But it certainly could have happened. And I think it happens generally under a few conditions. In a sense, the right wing in Israel has a very strong advantage, structural advantage, mostly because of the demographic issues you mentioned on national security and foreign policy. And it's not just demographics, I think it's also the history of the Israeli peace process. For most Israeli voters, the peace process, starting in 92, has been a failure and has been a successive failure of different attempts to either negotiate with the Palestinians, and then the second Intifada happened, or unilaterally withdraw, which is what the center provided at the time. And so the right wing, in a sense, has been validated in its doomsday scenarios about what happens if you give back anything. They haven't yet said what they're going to do in alternative, but they have been very successful in saying, you see, we were proven right. And especially, I think we need to emphasize the second Intifada. It was a long time ago, as Nathan mentioned, but it was a generational trauma that really broke the left wing. It broke the Labour Party, and the Labour Party has barely recovered since. This was actually quite an impressive recovery if you think about it. So on national security, the right wing has a clear advantage. Then on social economic issues, the left, in fact, has an advantage, and especially since 2011, when there was a huge, huge wave of demonstrations in Israel in favor of social democratic issues, hundreds of thousands of people in the street. It completely dwarfed Occupy Wall Street or anything like that. It was a very mainstream movement with hundreds of thousands out of 8 million. So a really big movement of people in the street, very disciplined, very orderly, very peaceful, demanding a change in the socioeconomic outlook and policy. So the left has a very strong advantage of that, and the Labour Party list reflects that to a large degree. Many of the leaders, or a couple of the important leaders of that movement came in, and other people who deal with these issues as well. So what would the left need to do to win, or the center? Well, I think it's old Bill Clinton triangulation. They would need to, on security, say, me too. You know, on security, there's no difference between me and Netanyahu. I'm not going to divide Jerusalem, which they try to do, of course. Don't worry, I'm exactly like Bibi, or maybe just a tad to the left. Don't worry, on security, you can trust me. Often the best way to do that is to have someone who has so many bars on his shoulder from his military service. It's very hard to argue that he doesn't understand security or isn't tough. So, for example, I mentioned the only 2 victories of labor. One was Lieutenant General, so the highest rank in the Israeli military, Rabin. The other was a Lieutenant General, the highest rank in the Israeli military, Ehud Barak. Both were chiefs of staff. That's how labor won. They did that, and then on social issues, they say there's a big difference. So just like Bill Clinton, where I'm weak, I'm just like H.W. Bush. No difference. Where I have an advantage, there's a huge difference. Notice how different we are. That said, the Labour Party is very damaged, and I think there is a possibility that a victory for someone other than Likud would be from the center, not necessarily from the left. And I just point out that 4 or 5 months ago, it was not obvious to me at all that Labour would be necessarily the opposition to Netanyahu. It could have been them. Clearly they were the best position to do it, but it wasn't clear that they would be the alternative. And last time, it could have been Yair Lapid. He was too new, but it was possible. So to a certain degree, there was a weakness of the leader. Herzog did not have the ability to say on security, I am the same kind of credibility. He doesn't have that. He's not as charismatic. He doesn't sound as forceful as Netanyahu. But I think there are certainly conditions where the center and the left could do, and even these elections could have ended differently. I mean, yes, the press and the pollsters mostly got it wrong, but it wasn't so wrong. It wasn't absurd that they thought that. The final word on this, I think there's one interesting finding from polls that you did see was that after the Second Intifada for a long time, for more than a decade, if you looked at young voters, they skewed to the right. And they skewed to the right on the security issue where Labor was still okay with older people, but younger people were skewing to the right on security. Lieberman was doing well. Naftali Bennett is still doing well among young. In these elections, you saw many of the younger people, including in non-representative straw polls in high schools and colleges, which don't mean anything in absolute terms, but the trend there does mean something. They've been skewing more to the left, and it's not on security. It's not on peace. It's on domestic things. They care dramatically about the spirit of 2011, the housing and the social justice, as it was called then. And so there are certainly countervailing trends, I think, but we still come back to the simple mathematical fact since 1977 is the right wing's to lose.
Well, if they hire you as a strategist, they might have a chance. Thanks for lining this out. Just changing and then closing it. On the international scene, I mean, you mentioned, of course, the fact that the relations between the present and new Israeli government and prime minister and the present U.S. president are certainly not going to improve, and especially after what we heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu just before the elections. But it seems to me even on a global scene, something we have to reconsider or consider, how do you see any danger if you look, for example, at Europe, which, Europe hasn't been the biggest supporter of Israel in many ways, but they also haven't been an enemy of Israel in many ways. And in Europe, the reactions were quite negative after the elections. And do you see some kind of danger of increasing isolation of Israel on the international scene, or maybe looking for new partners outside of the Western world?
Well, definitely there is a trend of isolation. There's no doubt of that. And we've seen it in Europe for a while already. And we will see more of it in the upcoming years, because Europeans do believe that economic pressure could move Israel. And we've seen it in many aspects. One of the big issues for Israelis was the European demand to mark produce and other export items from the West Bank settlements, specifically as being produced in the West Bank, presumably to hinder the possibility of them being marketed in Europe. That's a trend that's going on, and definitely we'll see more of that. Also in international bodies, we will see more European acceptance of the idea that Israel can be pressured in the UN, maybe even in the International Criminal Court. We'll see more of that happening. And of course, as the Europeans look to America and see it even slightly raising lifting its shield from Israel, they will sense there an opening to apply more pressure on Israel. Having said that, an interesting thing has happened. Netanyahu has proven in these elections that threats of isolation, that driving relations with the United States to an all-time low, doesn't really come with a political cost. And that could, in the longer term, influence those who think that you can pressure Israel by threatening to isolate it. Because the axiom, to a great extent, in Israeli politics was you can't mess up relations with the United States because the voters would never forgive you. And that goes back to 1992, when then Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir got into this very significant fight with President George H.W. Bush and his Secretary of State James Baker over settlements, over loan guarantees to Israel. And eventually he lost the elections. And many people said, well, the reason he lost the elections is because Israelis won't agree to have a leader that deteriorates relationship with the United States. Well, Bibi Netanyahu just proved that that's not the case, and the threats of isolation don't really come with a political cost. And in the long run, that may deter some who are thinking of pressuring Israel, because this pressure just doesn't work, or at least isn't working so far.
Last question. One of the new Knesset members is former Ambassador Michael Oren, who a lot of you also have met here, and he was at a few AU events as well. Do you see any role for him in the new government? And it's a little early to tell, but I wonder if there's anything you want to, Natan?
Yeah, he's a member. He's number 4 on Moshe Kahlon's list, so they're the winning veto player. But he's number 4, which means that he's not a candidate, for example, for foreign minister. I know there are a lot of people here, or not here, but in the city, who are thinking maybe he would do it. First, because Kahlon can't get 2 of the major portfolios. He's going to get finance, and that's one of the majors, and foreign affairs is another one. But he is in the cards, for example, for deputy foreign minister. And I think it's an interesting thing. Netanyahu has learned several things in his long political career. One is never forsake the base. He did that in 1999, and we saw now, as Nathan described, he went to the base on the last day, and all means, including some ugly ones. And he got that. But another thing that he learned is that when then speaking to the world, be sure to have a nice face to put out there. And so in the past, it's been, for example, the Labour Party at certain times. Ehud Barak was invited to join his party. It was Labour later. And then Barak joined in another time. Shimon Peres served in that role. He was former prime minister from Labour. He was president. Tzipi Livni in the last in the last term, she was justice minister, but as Nathan said, she was the effective foreign minister for Palestinian affairs. Avigdor Lieberman, who's a settler himself, even said, I have a conflict of interest on the Palestinian issue, so I'm not going to deal with it as foreign minister. Tzipi Livni did. Right now, it's not clear who's doing that. There's no one who does foreign policy from the center. The only center party that's going to join probably is Kahlon's. And Yair Lapid would join, but the ultra-Orthodox are vetoing that. And in Kahlon's party, there's really almost no one who deals with foreign affairs except Michael Oren. And he, in fact, is their main voice on foreign affairs. So he could be, and I imagine the highest position he could get politically is probably deputy foreign minister. He's not a political force in Israel. He's well known in Israel, but not to the same degree perhaps as here. And as deputy foreign minister could be quite effective. I would note there's one prime minister of Israel who came directly from being deputy foreign minister, and that's Bibi Netanyahu. He was deputy foreign minister in 1990, in fact, during the Madrid peace conference, and made his name as the big vocal spokesperson for the Israeli delegation in his English and his very good oratory, and then directly became prime minister without stopping in the ministerial post, which is unprecedented.
Yeah, I think no one would be very happy to be foreign minister with Michael Oren as the deputy. That was the same situation back with David Levy and the situation back then. Fine, we open it up, and as is our custom, if there are students who have questions, we take student first. And if there's no student first, then it's open. There's a student over there. Okay, we'll start with you.
Hi. Anyway, my question.
Introduce yourself briefly.
Sure. My name is Devin Mitchell. I'm a junior in the SPA. My question is about the list, the Arab list. I mean, I don't know a ton about Israeli politics, but I mean, if you're just looking from the left over, I mean, it's 14 seats, but I kept hearing, they're not going to form a government with them. What's their role going to be moving forward? Do you think there's any chance for some sort of, rapprochement with Zionism or even Meretz or something like that? Thanks.
Sorry. I get this question a lot, and it's a very different view from the United States and from Israel. They, on the one hand, the joint list managed to galvanize the Arab population, the Arab voters, and managed to get strong representation, and also a single bloc, which is 14 seats, the third largest party. That's formidable. That's important. But they are very much outside the Israeli political consensus. I really can't emphasize this enough. And that's both by the vast majority of Israeli voters, but also by them themselves. So they would not be invited to join a Herzog coalition. They would also refuse to join. They said that as long as occupation continues, they cannot serve. In part, if they were ministers, in a parliamentary system, Netanyahu is not the commander-in-chief in a parliamentary system, right? The prime minister is not the commander-in-chief of the military. The government, the cabinet as a whole, as a committee, is the commander-in-chief. And so ministers literally vote on, do we authorize this war or not, or this strike or not? They give orders to the military. And so for the Arab list, that would be extremely difficult if there was ever a crisis. And unfortunately, there will be a crisis. And so, so it's very hard for them. Secondly, as I said, they're extremely diverse. So there are 4 different parties. One is Hadash, which is Arab Jewish. Is very lefty, but is very much pro, and is very much pro coexistence. The leader, Ayman Oda, was also the joint leader of the list, nominally, speaks very good Hebrew, and his campaign was extremely outreaching towards Jewish Israelis. He said, I know Mizrahi Jews, so non-Ashkenazi Jews, won't vote for me, but I promise them I will work for them anyway. We believe in social justice, stuff like that. But then the other 3 parties, one of them is a classic Arab and semi-moderate list of Ahmed Tibi, but then we have 2 others. One is the Islamic movement, one faction of the Israeli Islamic movement, which is sort of similar to the Muslim Brotherhood, but in its very benign form in Israel, one of the 2 factions. And then the last one is Balad, which is, as I said, a secular and very nationalist Arab party. The founding head of it had to escape Israel because he's suspected of espionage for Hezbollah. They would never join. And in fact, before the elections, there was a suggestion of a surplus vote agreement between Meretz, the leftist party, and them. That's a complicated thing where you can imagine when you divide seats, votes by seats, it's never exact, right? You get 3.5 seats or 4.5 seats. That half can be divided according to an algorithm. For that, you need an agreement. They couldn't even do it. Balad wouldn't sign it with Meretz because Meretz is Zionist, and Meretz is on the far left of Israel. So the short answer is, in the short term, no. They're just not part of the game, and it's both by the majority and by the minority. Netanyahu speaking the way he did about the Arab minority is not paying much of a political price in Israel. He's paying internationally. Here it sounds atrocious, and to many Israelis it sounds atrocious. But he didn't pay a political price, and he wasn't afraid to do it. It was effective. And Lieberman, the foreign minister, is considerably worse to my mind in how he speaks about the Israeli minority as foreign minister. On the other hand, in the long term, we may see a trend now of the Arab population galvanizing and demanding its share of the pie. And the new leadership of Ayman Odeh may also suggest that some of it may turn into a more pragmatic, forward-looking leadership as opposed to Balad, which won't even cooperate with Meretz. The flip side, of course, is that when you unite all these forces, you strengthen the perception, both by Jews and Arabs in Israel, that this is one bloc. That communist Christian Arabs, or not, you can't be communist Christian, I guess, but Christian-born communist Arabs and the Islamic Party are all the same. They're Arabs, right? And ideologically, they're about as far apart as any two parties here. Really. There's nowhere else in the world could you see the Islamic Party and the communists sitting together. And that's good, but it's also very bad. It makes them Arab instead of, a variety of things. I will say, one of the 14 is Jewish. Dov Chanin, who's a member of Chadash, is a Jewish member of Knesset.
Yes, please.
I gotcha.
Alan Hausman, I'm from the neighborhood. For all of you, do any of you see Netanyahu having a Nixon moment, not right now, a couple of years down the road? Is that a hope, a chance, anything?
Just very briefly, it's his fourth term. It hasn't happened yet. The coalition doesn't suggest that there's any incentive to do that, so I see no reason in thinking that that would happen. There were those who thought that maybe, and that's kind of imposing American traditions on Israeli politics, that Netanyahu will now think more of his legacy and try to make this grand move. There is no indication of that.
And also, if I just may say, as you know, there is no term limit, so we can't even say it's in 2 years. It's his last 2 years because he can run again and get a fifth period. So there is no limit in terms of the legacy. Maybe the next legacy.
I just say that many people have been waiting for the Nixon moment for 3 full terms. Ari Shavit, whom you probably know, his excellent book, he's been writing about the Nixon moment that's about to come since the 90s. And it hasn't come. And I think when Netanyahu thinks about his legacy, he thinks about the legacy he believes in, which is what he says and what he does, which is he thinks that a deal with the Palestinians along the lines that the U.S. proposes is very bad for Israel. I don't think there's two ways about it. That's not to say he can't be pragmatic in certain moments. He can. But I tend to believe, especially after so many years, that he means what he says. And the Palestinian thing equivocates often, but as the other Nathan said, I mean, he's a known commodity. That was his benefit in these elections. That was also to his detriment.
Yes, the mic is coming.
My name is George Johnson. I'm with Moment Magazine. I'm wondering whether there's anything to learn in the election about the nationality groups in Israel, about the Mizrahi and their role, whether that's changing, the Russian Jews, the different ethnic groups in Israel. Do we see any changes in their voting behavior, and what can we expect in the future?
I can start off. With the Russian Jews, it's interesting. I mean, the first generation immigrants from the former Soviet Union were always seen as right-wingers, and that explained Avigdor Lieberman's political success. And part of the reason of his political decline, if you put aside the corruption issues that are going to send half his party to prison very soon, one of the reasons, if the explanations of this decline, is that second and third generation immigrants from the former Soviet Union don't necessarily follow these patterns, and even though they are still, as a group, they still trend more to the right. It's not as strong a trend as we've seen in the past. Regarding Mizrahi Jews, it's interesting because, well, first of all, one could argue that is it even an issue nowadays to be a Mizrahi Jew? And surprisingly, it is, because it is a part of the identity issue that we spoke about before. We've seen a split there with Kahlon trying to run, to a certain extent, on the Mizrahi ticket as being the representative of not explicitly an ethnic group, but of a socio-economic group that's identified with this ethnic group. But on the other side, we see Mizrahis, of course, voting traditionally for the Likud, as they've been for many years, for Shas, and of course, many of them also vote for other parties because Israel is such a mixed-up society as it is nowadays. Do you want to add something on that?
I'd only say that I agree completely with what Nathan said. I think the only, on the one hand, there's surprising persistence to the way to these identity things, especially the Mizrahi Ashkenazi thing. But I would just say, especially in the younger generation and the not so young generation, our generation, many people are mixed. I mean, it's not. I think people overestimate what a difference it is. A mixed Ashkenazi Mizrahi couple in Israel doesn't even raise one hair of an eyebrow. No one even notices that kind of thing anymore. I can't tell you how many friends I have who are mixed because I don't even notice it. So there still is strong correlates. Certainly Mizrahi origin correlates with lower socioeconomic class still. But that aspect at least is partly a matter of time. You would think that this would have been enough time, and it is apparently not.
Yes, please.
How do you think, if there will be sanctions against Israel in Europe, which will have an economic impact, will it lead the Israelis more to the left parties, or it will strengthen even more the right parties?
Well, I think that's the key question here is what kind of sanctions are we talking about? Are we talking about these limited symbolic steps being taken by the European Union? It won't make any dent in terms of Israel's economy, so it won't be significant. If we're talking about Iran-style sanctions, definitely that would change the situation, but no one's talking about that right now. I think that does also go to the issue of the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And the premise of that movement is that you can pressure domestic politics you can shift domestic politics by applying economic pressure from the outside. Israel sees BDS as one of its greatest threats. So far, we haven't seen any success of the boycott movement, either in applying real pressure or in moving Israeli policy. So I don't think on the government level anything will happen, but if anything does move on the grassroots level, and that can include things as benign as rock bands not refusing to put on shows in Israel, or academic boycotts, which is something that I'm sure many people over here have been discussing. That has the potential probably of making a change, but it hasn't reached any kind of critical mass yet that will see that change.
You want to add briefly?
Yeah, briefly to that. I think there's two other things. One is what kind of sanctions it is. Is it targeted against Israel writ large? Or is it targeted against occupation or settlements? And this makes a huge difference. If you target Israel writ large, it can convince Israelis that it's part of some of the BDS movement, I'd say the core of the BDS movement, which is just hostile to Israel, period. And versus, say, what the EU was doing, which was, you have to tag things from the settlements, that conveys a very different message, which is where, in fact, in part of the programs, they were giving money for research in Israel. They're giving money to Israel, but they are demanding certain things about occupation and settlements. That conveys a very different message to the average Israeli, or to every Israeli. The second thing is that we could see both. When there's pressure applied, people tend to rally around the flag. But then that can dissipate. And especially if there's long-term pressure, which I think is a real danger for Israel, it could be different. If Israelis go to vacation in Europe and they can't use their credit card because it says Israeli bank, in the long term it could have a very dramatic effect, but it could be in both directions.
Thank you. There?
Here to Brest, I'm also from the neighborhood. In the days running up to the election, and I think this was either in the Jerusalem Post or in the Washington Post, they had you could visit on their website and you could watch commercials run by the different parties. And I was particularly taken by a commercial that was run by Shaz, and which you and others, and read, was a very religious party, an Orthodox party. But the commercial did not feel like it at all. Instead, it was a commercial that made fun of middle class or middle class Israelis, complaining about the price of a vacation in Eilat, and the fact that they were being bothered by somebody asking for money while sitting on a terrace, and it had it concluded by saying, we will not worry about the middle class, which is doing just fine, but we are going to worry about those people that actually do need help, which is the bottom 5 or 1%. And it just did not come across as a religious platform at all. I mean, there was no word at all of any religious theme in the commercial. And so I was wondering if you could put that in some context. I mean, I was puzzled and surprised.
I'll just I'll let the Nathans answer. We discussed this among other election spots in our class on Israel actually recently, and one thing which was, for those of you who saw the spot, it was interesting. It was really fascinating. You're totally right. I think this issue did not come across. Of course, people know in Israel what Shas stands for, but what did come across was relating to the question before. In the same spot was the Mizrahi Ashkenazi divide. That was, I think, very much part of that spot. So I'll just add to that. But you want to?
I agree. It's Shas, whether they're concerned about struggling Israelis is authentic or not, that's a separate issue. But it does position itself as a party that's not only religious or ultra-Orthodox, but is also the party of a certain class and a certain ethnic group, meaning lower-class Mizrahi Jews. There isn't necessarily an identity between that group and the group of Haredi ultra-Orthodox, but for reasons that have to do mainly with the fact that there is no other party that's taking on this mantle, because as Aryeh Deri, the leader of Shas, noted in that commercial you were referring to, they're worried about the middle class, not about the lower class. So Shas has stepped into this position. I think looking at the record after, 3 decades in various governments, you could argue that Shas hasn't done much for struggling Israelis that are outside the realm of ultra-Orthodox, of Sephardi ultra-Orthodox.
We'll go here.
I'm Roger. I'm a student. My question is how a new Democrat or a Republican president in the 2016 elections in this country would change the relation with Israel?
That's a good question. I think it very much depends if it's a Republican or Democratic president. But I would start by saying that, by and large, the relationship, I agree with Nathan, is in crisis and it's gone from bad to worse. The fundamentals still are there. So what President Obama would always say in the election campaign was true. The security cooperation, the intelligence cooperation is better than ever. That's actually correct. The relations at the top are very bad, and they've gotten significantly worse, and they may get worse in a week. If there's a deal with Iran, they may get even worse. So it partly depends who the president is. I think whoever it is, if let's say Hillary Clinton gets elected, I think there's a considerable chance that it would get better in some respects. But the differences, and if it's a Republican, certainly it would get much better. But the differences are fundamental, and I think part of the damage of the Netanyahu visit was to expose a difference between the liberal aspect of the liberal constituency of many Democrats and their traditional support for Israel, which was never in conflict in the past. In the past, in fact, that was part of being a liberal. And today, for many Democrats, it's harder. And I think for one generation below the leadership of the Democratic Party, they look at their leaders and they see just how angry Nancy Pelosi is with Netanyahu, or how angry the president is. And you can imagine most of them probably campaigned for Obama. Whether you support Obama or not, they probably campaigned for him. And the result is that I think very soon you will see less of a ironclad support, as you see from the leadership of the Democratic Party today, for Israel. You're still going to see widespread support for Israel. It's very popular in the United States. That's why American legislators support Israel, because it's popular among voters. There are other conspiracy theories. That's the fundamental reason. But nonetheless, it's become much more partisan. I'll just say one more thing, which is if you think of the last debate, the foreign policy debate between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama, Israel was raised 30-something times, I think it was, versus China was 5 or 9 or something, less than 10. And it's not because Israel's bigger than China, and it's not only because Israel is an obsession in America, it is, luckily for us, but it's also because Romney and the Republicans identify a weakness for the Democrats in claiming you guys are not pro-Israel enough. And the Democrats recognize the same thing and see a political need to defend themselves. So the president was saying, you should know Iron Dome, and we supported security and intelligence, all that, which is true. And so you had this battle over this issue, and I think it's a symptom of the fact that there's political gain to be made there. I think this suggests that maybe not 2016, but sooner or later you're going to see more of a divergence there, and I think from the Israeli perspective it's very worrying.
It's just also, I think, harder and harder to say what is the support for, what does it mean, support for Israel? When Obama says what he says, 40% of Israelis see this as support for what their Israel is, and maybe 60% who are right of the center don't see it as support, but it's not necessarily support for Israel, it's support for a certain policy, which some Israelis agree with and others don't, as we see. We'll go in the very back.
Hi, my name is Kevin Michael Levy. I'm a junior here at ASIS. And my question, it's not entirely a question at the front, but I think it's an amazing thing that we have such a great audience here tonight. But something that's a little troubling to me as a student who supports Israel is that I don't see a lot of students in the audience. Do you think that the fiery rhetoric used in the last election cycle makes it that much harder for students at a liberal university like this to come out to events like this?
Probably for you, yeah.
That's for the students to ask. I mean, to answer. Well, they're usually in the back, but there are a few. But it's they're too busy. I don't think it's really related to the specifics of the Israeli elections. It's something which I think students have to answer. It's hard for us to answer, but please.
I did want to just add something that's related to it. There is polling data, and I don't have it in front of me, that shows less engagement in terms of Israel the younger the people are. And it does show, this is polling that's done mainly with Jewish young Americans, but I think it is symptomatic to other parts of the society as well. And when you dig in deeper and you ask them, most would say that there is a growing feeling that Israel, that the issue of Israel and being engaged in pro-Israeli activity puts them in some kind of a conflict with their liberal values. And instead of dealing with it, they'd rather just disengage, and that's why we see a distancing of younger Americans. Again, this data refers mainly to Jewish Americans. We see a distancing from Israel altogether instead of dealing with it.
Let me just add that in terms of classes, we still see a lot of interest for classes Israel-related, Jewish or non-Jewish students, U.S. or international students. That is undiminished, and I think will stay for a while. Questions, Don? I think the mic is coming.
Thank you, Donald Myers. I just want to go back to the point that you were making earlier about there's some political advantage or less political disadvantage in antagonizing the United States. I read some articles in the paper recently by some mostly from the right, saying that Israel is strong now and it doesn't need other countries and it doesn't need the United States and it has a powerful military. Is there some concern among some of the electorate that that could be really problematic for Israel? That in the United Nations, for example, with all the anti-Israel rhetoric, the U.S. has stood up for Israel more times than any other country and has voted no against various positions, otherwise it would have been adopted by the Security Council. Is there some concern in Israel that there might be some political advantage or not much political disadvantage, but long term the whole exercise could be self-defeating?
I can just start by saying that even though, as you know, Netanyahu didn't pay a political price for antagonizing the Obama administration, Obviously, there is. The problem is that Israelis have grown to take American support for granted. And this is something that we've seen in the past, I guess, 3 decades or so, which is based on the fact that consecutive American administrations were very supportive of Israel, and that there's a very strong base of support among the American public for Israel. And therefore, the prospect of losing support of the United States is something that's hard for Israelis to imagine. And you look at the key aspects of it. Well, there's $3.1 billion in foreign military assistance to Israel. Everyone has made clear that no one is going to touch that ever. Regardless of how bad the situation gets, America will continue to provide for Israelis, for Israel's military. And of course, there's this concept of America as the main backer of Israel, whether it's in the international arena, and we've seen vetoes in the UN Security Council, and behind-the-scenes diplomatic work to block any kind of initiative that would corner Israel, and also on the military front, because even though there is no explicit treaty about it, Israel believes, and I think rightly so, that if in need, it can always count on the support of the United States in terms of defense. So I don't think Israelis can even visualize the idea of losing American support. Right now, this whole discussion surrounds the issue of is Obama being polite to Netanyahu? Was Netanyahu invited to the White House? Did he slight the president or not? We're still in the environment of protocol and politeness. I don't think Israelis even think about the broader issues because it seems so far-fetched right now.
Maybe we'll just take it down. You can also answer to that. Yes, please. You get the microphone, please.
Hi, it's Roy Simon. I just want to find out what you think about Iran and the way the vote came out. Wouldn't Prime Minister Netanyahu see a real opportunity now, irrespective of whether there is an agreement or a not agreement, that he has the right now under his political jurisdiction with Beitano, Likud, and Jewish Home to bomb Iran right now? Wouldn't he see it's the right time to now go Israeli bombing of Iran, given his political support, with no one maybe from Shas or UTJ or any of the other parties in his government actually pulling him back, whereas Yesh Atid was pulling him back before?
So the short answer is I think not, and for a few reasons. First, I don't think it was Yesh Atid that was pulling him back. It was the commanders and leaders of all the security forces who vehemently opposed the attack, especially the chief of staff of the military and the head of the Mossad, Meir Dagan, who just spoke very vehemently against Netanyahu in these elections as well, head of the Shin Bet, the domestic security forces, and the head of the military intelligence. They were all unanimous in their opposition to a unilateral strike. That's not because they're doves on Iran. They're not at all doves on Iran. And it's not because they would necessarily oppose a U.S. strike on Iran. They might even support that. But they did oppose, and I think they still oppose very strongly, their successors still oppose a unilateral Israeli strike that would probably accelerate the Iranian program, and also would be done in the face of an international community that is probably closing in on a deal with Iran. Then you could count on a dramatic crisis with the United States, even more so than today. And so I imagine he won't do it. And I don't think politics is what stopped him in the past. There were certainly some ministers who did. I think the main ministers who stopped them then were not from the opposition. They were from the Likud. Benny Begin, Dan Meridor, and even Moshe Bogi Ya'alon, the Minister of Defense, was very hawkish on other issues, but has a lot of military experience, and like the other military people, tends to be more prudent. So I think he would probably not go that route. I would add one more thing to the issue of the U.S.-Israeli relations. I think Israelis are not quite understanding what it might mean, and I think the reality in which there is no automatic veto in the Security Council, where there's possibility of EU sanctions moving forward, irrespective of the U.S., all that I think is not quite sunk in. I think also Netanyahu did not pay. Should be said, Netanyahu did not pay a big price in part because he didn't face the same president he faced in the 90s. When he opposed Clinton, when Clinton was absolutely irate with the same Netanyahu paid a big price for that. But Obama is extremely unpopular in Israel, and Israelis are much closer to Netanyahu than to Obama on the Iran issue, for example. And so when there's a quarrel between Netanyahu and Obama, I think Netanyahu pays much less of a price than he did, for example, against Bill Clinton, who, as many have said, could have won the elections in Israel himself.
Okay, let's take the three last questions and collect them and then answer collectively. We'll start from the back and go to the front.
Hi, Brian Downey, and thank you very much for your presentations and discussion. Quick question, one more about his speech and about the question of two-state settlement. Did his speech turn out to be a political miscalculation in this sense? If I understood you correctly, he didn't really get a bump out of the speech domestically, but he did get a bump out of his statements a couple of days before about the possibility of a two-state solution. Is that a possibility that he miscalculated in that he did not get a bump, so why did he burn that bridge, so to speak, temporarily or not?
Thank you. We'll keep that in mind, and we'll take the next question.
So going along with that,
Please introduce yourself also, please.
Jeremy Smith, I'm a SIS student here. So you talked about how even if the center left won the election, if Herzog was, he became prime minister, that still there would be no real process for a peace settlement. So if we're talking about a peace settlement that's agreed on by Israel, that isn't imposed on them by the UN or anything else, given the rightward movement of Israeli politics and the seeming popularity of saying that there will be no Palestinian state, where would you see any kind of peace deal coming from within the Israeli political system in the near future?
That's a big one, yes. And we'll go all the way to the front with the mic.
How do you see Israel interjecting itself to the 2016 election campaign?
Thank you. Nathan, you want to start?
We can start. Maybe we'll start with the last point. How will Israel be interjected into the 2016 campaign? You got the answer today already when Senator Cruz announced that he's running for the Republican nomination in 2016. One of the main issues he made there is that he said, imagine a president who does not get into fights with Israel. Definitely, that will be a rallying point for Republicans.
They said he got more applause for this than for any other statement he made.
So it can play in several ways. I think Republicans will use it to try and win over Jewish voters. We should keep in mind Jewish voters is more of a myth than a reality. There are very few, and they vote heavily Democratic, and there's a lot of discussion about moving very few votes. He can, however, it does help. Raising the Israel issue does help tremendously with Christian evangelical voters, which actually do have the masses, and of course it helps with a few heavy Republican voters that could also make the difference.
Well, starting with this, I agree with Nathan. I think on the Israeli side, whether they try to interject or not, I think to their mind they didn't interject to the degree that it seemed to be here. I think it very much depends on who it is. I'm not sure it was so much a matter of Democratic, Republican. It was partly a matter of a shared donor that Mitt Romney and Netanyahu had, and in all seriousness. And so I think partly it was the same people who dealt with Sheldon Adelson and facilitated the sort of cooperation with Romney, which appeared from here to be interjecting. But I'm sure it's going to be a hot issue, just as Nathan said. On the other two issues, I think when I saw the speech in Congress, leading up to it, Israelis in polling numbers clearly thought it was a mistake and thought it was a political thing. Israelis tend to be quite cynical. I have to be honest, I'm not suspect of lacking cynicism towards Netanyahu's politics, but I thought a lot of it was genuine. I thought he also came because of the topic itself, the Iran issue. And to my mind, the scene of him speaking to these raucous applause, and the august setting of the Congress, all that was excellent spectacle from a political perspective. And most Israelis, like any person with a real job in the world who's not obsessed with these things, don't know the exact difference between Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid, and John Boehner. They've never heard of any of them. So they just saw, well, why would they, right? So they saw this wonderful scene. So, to my mind, it was a very good spectacle. It didn't pan out. It seemed to be 1 or 2 seats in the polls and then dissipated. I would say 2 things. It's first of all, it could definitely have been wrong. That's the most likely option. The second likely option is that it may have delayed some of the slippage that he had later towards Herzog, which he gained again in the end with Israeli. And third, it did help keep the agenda on foreign policy, national security. And it was a very clear contrast. It is impossible to imagine Herzog delivering that kind of speech because it's not who Herzog is, who has other good qualities, but that is not one of them. Finally, on the two-state solution, I think if Herzog and Livni led the next government, it would be considerably different in the short term. There's a dramatic crisis brewing with the Palestinian Authority. It's running out of money fast, partly because Israel is withholding Palestinian tax money in retaliation for the ICC move by the Palestinians. Palestinian Authority is already paying less than about 60% of its salaries. If that continues with the security forces, we could see a dramatic downturn in security in the West Bank and the possibility of a third intifada or something resembling that. And that could be very different between 2 governments. This government might also free those funds. I think a Herzog-Livni government would be very likely to have freed those funds and some other things that would have helped buttress Abbas's situation. Moreover, I think it would have kept alive much more easily the idea that Israel is still committed to the two-state solution and facilitated, perhaps, even if there's no peace deal during Herzog's time, which I agree with, would have facilitated the transition after Abbas within the context of a possibility of a two-state solution. I think that's much harder today. It may still be possible. It's much harder today.
I'd just like to add one word on that. Should keep in mind that for Israelis, and they may not admit it publicly, but for Israelis, it's not only about, well, we have to choose between a two-state solution and a one-state solution, because there's a silent majority that believes in the status quo. The status quo is pretty comfortable for Israelis. Security, as we mentioned, is at a good point for Israelis. They feel safe. International pressure isn't that massive. There is no drive to resolve the Palestinian issue, and we've seen that in the elections as well. So there's a one-state solution, there's a two-state solution, and for many Israelis, there's just the current situation solution, and they don't see any reason to go ahead and change it.